Hello and welcome to Wisdom and Productivity, the podcast of Dr. Efraín Martinez. I am a principal in search of wisdom, and I have found productivity to be a great tool for success. Today I have the great and distinguished honor of having with me Dr. Ignacio Lopez, who is the Deputy Provost at National Louis University and the author of The EQ Way: How Emotionally Intelligent School Leaders Navigate Turbulent Times. Dr. Ignacio Lopez, who are you?
Oh, man. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Martinez, for having me on the podcast. I'm really excited to be here. I am a lifelong educator, learner, former high school teacher, former school administrator who turned his attention to researching cultural relevance and emotional intelligence in schools. Years ago, I wound up researching non-punishment interventions in schools, working with, students and families to navigate, some concerns in their buildings at the time during the dropout factory era, that era years ago, and really have just continued to find a lot of passion and inspiration in studying leaders and teachers that are really doing powerful things for children. And so I'm happy to be here and happy to share more about the EQA.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it, Ignacio. So, for the listeners of the show, can you walk us through your professional trajectory up to this point?
Yes. So my career started off as a after school matter poetry teacher. I have a degree in English and nonfiction writing and poetry. And right out of college, I was teaching in an after school matters program, and I loved it. It was not a lot of money, maybe $5 a day. And my girlfriend, my wife now today, thank God, my girlfriend at the time said, hey, if we're gonna make something on our lives, $5 a day is not gonna cut it. So, I fell in love with teaching, and a student said, hey, you should be a teacher, and I wound up finishing a master's in arts and teaching. And I became an English teacher, a reading teacher, an avid teacher in the Chicago public schools, and sort of worked my way through the ranks as an administrator, leading curriculum and instruction. So that was some of the fun stuff. Sometimes some of the not so fun stuff was leading all the assessment, collecting ACT exams at the time, running AP exams at the high school. And slowly, when I finished my doctorate, I did a doctorate degree in human learning and development. And as I mentioned at the top, I was able to study at the time the Chicago Public Schools were navigating two turnaround systems. There was sort of a private version of school turnaround and the Chicago public school version when they had the Office of School Turnaround. And I was sort of right at the nexus of trying to understand what happens to schools and communities as they go through turnaround. And at the time, was finishing my doctorate, had an opportunity to leave the public schools and become a professor of education at National Louis University, where I really wound up, digging into the research and studying mentoring habits of instructional coaches, working with new teachers, new teacher mentoring program in those turnaround schools. And years later, was tapped on the shoulder to become the assistant dean of the College of Education at National Louis, and sort of kept growing from there into administration. And I currently serve as their deputy provost, really leading curriculum, new program development, instructional quality efforts for the university. But my passion is and has always been with the community, with our students, and really just learning how people learn, and really supporting both teachers and leaders in school spaces doing good things for young people. So, yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing. A couple of follow-up questions.
Sure.
For those of us who might be interested in jumping into the higher education world,
Yeah.
what lessons did you learn and what recommendations do you have for those who have worked in school all their professional trajectory and want to do that leap?
Yeah, I would say get involved in becoming an adjunct. Get to know who the university faculty are and the program chair. We always say the program chairperson is really the person who helps to do the staffing for the adjunct classes or courses. So if you're in education and you want to teach teachers about ESL or special ed or other key areas, whether it's in technology or STEM related work, I know universities are always searching for faculty to help teach in those particular spaces. I think early childhood in the city of Chicago seems to be there's a big need in supporting, teachers who want to become early childhood educators. We're seeing a growth in some of those programs in Chicago and in Illinois. And so, the program chair is always the sort of lead in. The dean is not a bad person. I served as the dean for 4 years for the College of Professional Studies, and I would often receive emails from leaders and teachers saying, "Hey, here's my resume. Can I teach?" That's not wrong, right? I sometimes those are like long shots, but the dean also knows sort of the staffing of each of the colleges, and that's really key. And then the other piece to that is, I think if you're trying to make a leap into higher ed to be a professor and or a researcher, then finding the time to be able to present, right? Like, are there conferences that you are submitting your proposals to that you can speak at, whether it's ASCD or the Learning Forward Conference or the ESCA or what used to be the National Title I Conference? Those are like the big name education conferences that teachers and leaders can start to share their own wisdom that can also sort of parlay that into finding a connection to the universities. Yeah.
Beautiful. One more follow-up question. What makes a good adjunct? The type of adjunct that universities don't want to let go of.
Yeah. I would say the adjuncts that I've worked with personally, who we don't ever want to let go, are the ones who understand sort of the culture, the nature of the college and the program that you're teaching in. They raise their hand to be part of just the staff meetings or any PLC or professional learning opportunity that's happening directly with the program. Those are the adjuncts that we know we can count on, that we can call upon and sort of relate to. There's also opportunities that emerge beyond teaching. So if we need someone to help write or co-create curriculum or work on developing new assessments for particular courses that align to the program learning outcomes, adjuncts can do more than just teaching. They can raise their hand to say, "Hey, I can do assessment work, or I can do curriculum development work. I'm happy to also lead a session for students on this that's sort of beyond the course expectations." And so those are a couple of things that I would recommend adjuncts be able to do and really stay connected with the culture. There's also opportunities to get involved at the university level through adjunct council. Those pieces, I think, through like how my adjuncts be able to stay connected through the shared governance practices of a university. That's when we know we have adjuncts. I know the university I work at, we also have what we call our professional adjunct lecturers, who we know, though, that's like the cadre of adjuncts that we will always be calling upon, right, as like our go-to adjuncts who can give us a little bit more in addition to the teaching. So yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Those are great advice. Usually you don't see that anywhere. So you got to hear in Wisdom and Productivity.
Yeah.
So Ignacio, like in Back to the Future, if you could go back in time to any of the professional positions you have held in the past, what would the Ignacio of today tell the Ignacio of back then?
Oh, wow. I would say patience. I would say, I graduated high school early. This connects to my wisdom here for what I would tell myself. I grew up, my mom was my kindergarten teacher, and so she moved us into school fast. So always as a young person, I was the youngest of anyone in my classrooms. I was 16 years old as a high school senior, and I was trying to always be in moving forward fast and in learning and writing and education. I finished my doctorate. I was 27 years old. I was already writing books early. I was 37 when I became president at Harold Washington Community College. So, I was really trying to drive at this younger age. And I think I would go back now and say, there's an urgency, but there's no need to be so urgent all the time. And as a leader, just listening and sitting in other people's wisdom is what I would tell myself, right? And not to worry, because I think my whole thing was like, but it's always worked out, right? In whatever sort of leadership position I've held, the good, the bad, regardless, it's always worked to some sort of positive momentum. So don't worry so much.
Beautiful. Great advice. Thank you so much, Ignacio. So let's talk about books. If you have to gift two books to a loved one fiction and one nonfiction, which books will those be and why?
Oh, wow. Recently, the nonfiction, I have been working with friends and family, and even in the EQA, as I did my research for that, I really liked Amanda Ripley's book on high conflict. And I recommend that even in the sessions that I have been, sharing with others. When I was in DC last week, I'll be in Orlando next week. I think that we're in a space now where all of us, because of our high connectivity through social media, the globalization of our world, sort of the complexity of relationships, really understanding people's why, and that not everything is conflict, and that some conflict is good, it can help us in making decisions. And so I really like that high conflict book in the way that Amanda presents the writing and the research and the story and the narrative of the why. There's some talk about mediation with attorneys and whatnot in higher conflict situations, but at the end of the day, a lot of what we navigate, both as people and as leaders, is interpersonal problems or interpersonal opportunities for relationships. And so that would be that book. The sort of nonfiction, I have a few that I've been thinking about, but what comes to mind is, the work around poetry and the Book of Questions by the Chilean, I don't know, I guess this is more also in the poetry fiction, nonfiction world. There's a poetry book. Oh my gosh, and now I'm blanking on the author. I have to find it here. But it's the Book of Questions, and it's Chilean poetry, and it really is also about and it's in both Spanish and English that I recommend. Partly because the other thing that I've noticed as a person and as a leader in listening is also learning how to ask the right questions. And so when we as leaders learn how to ask the right, and as people, when we learn how to ask the right questions, we can elicit more from friends, from families, from coworkers, from other leaders. And sometimes there is creativity in our questioning, which is why I like merging sort of the poetry aspect of that work. But it's the Book of Questions, and the poetry author will come to me, famous author. Now I'm drawing a blank, but we can Google it.
I appreciate it, man. I will definitely look for that one.
Yeah.
So talking about books, the EQA, how emotional intelligence school leaders navigate turbulent times. Tell us about the origin story of writing this book.
Yeah. So, I about right before COVID, I had been studying emotional intelligence and cultural relevance in learning spaces and in schools. and working with leaders. And I presented at a conference in Illinois. I think it was like the fall of 2019. And I had developed this thinking because there's a lot of conversations around emotional intelligence and cultural relevance that are like, well, how do you do that, right? Or like, and there's a great article. It's cultural responsive teaching. How do you do that? And oftentimes it's not so much in the doing, it's in how we think, right? As leaders and as teachers. But I had been working with so many leaders who were like, but how do we get to some of the doing? And so I crafted and did this research around these steps for moving towards emotional intelligence and or cultural relevance in our schools. And I had designed these sort of 7 steps, if you will. It's like 4 or 5 steps, but ultimately when I finished the research for the EQA, we landed on sort of 7 big like practices, right? And so it all started then when it was like, well, step 1, how do I interpret emotional intelligence, or how do I as a leader interpret cultural relevance? How do I communicate that work? How do we navigate and work with our teams? How do we navigate resistance? How do we work with external stakeholders? And then how do we create the sustainability in our schools around cultural relevance and emotional intelligence? And so then COVID hit, right? And I was like, oh, okay, how do we navigate some of this, and how can I test some of this working with our leaders and principals across the country? So, I have served as a school board member here in Skokie for almost 10 years now. And so had an opportunity to work with leaders here in the Skokie and Evanston area, principals and superintendents. I was doing some consulting and research work with the whole child effort that was coming out of ASCD, and states like Ohio had adopted these whole child frameworks that were grounded in emotional intelligence, et cetera. And so had an opportunity to work with leaders in Ohio and in Maryland and in Texas, and wound up, through these sort of collaborative efforts, consulting research efforts, drawing, like in the midst of COVID, but also in the midst of this high turbulence of like book banning and the removing of police officers in schools and confrontations with community-based organizations, all of these sort of big conflict, turbulent challenges that were being, that were coming to the schools. I was like, okay, there's a lot here, and there's something happening with like successful leaders, principals, and superintendents that know how to get through those really sticky situations. And I wound up working with those leaders, 1, who stayed through the turbulence, and 2, who were moving the needle on their school culture, on student sense of belonging, on teacher retention, and wound up sort of landing on 7 big ideas or practices that were sort of common from all of these principals and the superintendents. And that was really the process, right? Was, okay, I seeded it years ago as like a step-by-step thing, but then I went to see if it was truly, and then COVID, for good or bad, it was sort of it was not good for our country, but for those of us in the research world, we were like, oh man, what can we draw from this and capture some of this wisdom in a way that could help other leaders? And so that's how the EQA sort of came about in the research for that. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you. So let's peel that onion. So you're using Dan Goldman's 5 steps: self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, and social skills. For a principal or school leader who might feel that they are drowning, what advice do you have? Like, what is the practical advice? What is the EQ way for this principle to follow?
Yeah. So the first out of all sort of practices. So if you look at, like in the book I write, so each chapter actually takes you through those sort of areas of practice as you're navigating these difficult challenges. And one of the things that I do sort of calibrate is like the key concept to this, one of the key concepts to this work is this notion of emotional intelligence, right? So first, you mentioned Dan Goleman's work. So Dan Goleman, if you've not read his work on emotional intelligence and leadership, you should go back and do that, because there's a lot of great nuggets in there for your, like, reflection. But there is sort of the difference, when we talk to leaders, there's a difference between me as a leader or and my emotional intelligence and the resources that I need for the individual. And then there are like the resources that our teachers use and or need for their children. And so there's the Dan Goleman research framework for me. And then we look at other frameworks like CASEL, the Collaborative for Social Emotional Intelligence. Those folks have done really great work in understanding how you build EQ into curriculum, teaching and learning, SEL programming, etc. And so there's sort of what is it that my teachers really need? Is it that they need these supports for them teaching more children about the EQA, and that's like the CASEL's work, or is it that me and my community need more on ourselves as leaders, as people in the building? And that's important to understand, because once as a leader, it's like, okay, this is more of I talk about a systems anxiety issue. This is more of like the people culture thing versus the teachers and students thing, right? So once I know how to unpack that as a leader, that's one key piece of advice. It's like, how do you interpret and or understand sort of where the challenges are? Is it classroom or is it more people? That was a big thing. The other thing that we talk about is, okay, once you're unpacking that, are you thinking about, we talk about challenges defined as organizational or situational, right? So what we mean by that is, are there pressures on your school because of community, because of politics, because of COVID, right? There's on the organization because of our economy, because of race relations, because of all of those organizational impactful things? Or are the challenges and conflicts in your school between you and teacher, you and parent, you and a board member, whatever, right? So like, and so you have to be able to understand that. The book that I've written on the EQ way, I go into a little bit of both, but I really look at sort of the organizational, how the school as an organization can be built and constructed and supported to move through these challenging times, whether there's a union strike in your building, whether there's budgetary cuts in your building, whether there's violence or other trauma that may have happened in and around your building. And so how do you set up systems to be sort of navigating that work? That's really what the book gets into. So the first and foremost, though, advice is, what do you know about EQ, right, for yourself, and in what areas do you want to get better at? I often struggle with self-regulation because I lead with a lot of passion, and it's great to lead with passion, but if I'm saying by next Friday we can have all fourth graders, and the teachers are looking at you like, what, are you crazy, right? Like, so principle over passion, and you obtain that knowledge by recognizing, okay, I need to calm down, or I didn't say that the right way, or I failed to include so-and-so, I should have brought them in, right? So you wind up sort of seeing those 5 dimensions. That really is the heart of the EQA. And the first piece of advice that I give the principals that I work with is that, yeah.
Beautiful. And that's what is very awesome about your book, that it's not only about us, but it's about the people that we are leading. So in a part of the book that I thought it was quite interesting, you talk about emotions and the clarity of the leader's vision. And you tell us about the story of the ILT, that jokingly your team members will say, Ignacio Lopez talks for ILT.
Yeah.
Can you share with us about this story and the importance of having clarity in our visions?
Yes. Yeah, I love this. This research comes from the mission driven leader. I have all those resources in the book, and there's some reflections, questions in that book as well. But there is power in our words as leaders when we are organizing or navigating turbulent times or change in our buildings. And we need to create or build the capacity of our teams. You know, we often talk about leading as we talk about leading as a manager or leading as a trainer or leading as a coach. But what we're really trying to get at with the EQA is leading as a capacity builder. And what that means is, you know, giving trust to your teacher teams, to your assistant principals, to other leaders in your building. And in my story in the book, I failed to do that. We wanted to create a culture where we began to demystify teaching and learning at the high school level. The idea was, you know, is there an appreciative inquiry approach to some really cool teaching and learning practices happening in and across our school building? At the time, we were focused on a writing to learn. Like, what does writing to learn feel like and look like in our school culture? And we built an instructional leadership team. I also write in the book about, you know, sometimes we need to incubate teams. We can talk about that here a little later. In this particular case, that's exactly what we did. And we found teachers from across the building who we thought could be champions of creating a culture where we can come in and out of classrooms, or we can go look for and or wonder about instructional practices that will help the people walking in our learning walks and would also then help teaching. And so really just creating a non-punitive, non-I gotcha sort of culture of like, wow, you know, instead of going out and spending all this money on professional development, there's a lot in our building that we can learn about teaching and learning. And so we built this instructional leadership team to do that. What happened was I was young and I was so excited. And I did the agendas and I was planning the PD for next week and I was finding the articles for and I was like, oh man. And everyone was so nice. And there was 8 of us on that team and we would meet on Wednesdays after school. And everybody was nice and people read the articles. But after a while, I started to like see what was, because we were moving, but it didn't feel like people were like galvanized to really. And what happened was I heard someone say in the hallway, hey, because we're like, oh, we have an ILT meeting on Wednesday after school. And someone said, oh, another Ignacio Lopez talks meeting, you know. And my epiphany at that time was like, oh man, I have to give trust to these teachers. I have to give control away in this particular situation. And we did just that, right? And we wound up saying, okay, how do we turn this over? Let's create some norms for the team on how to sort of move our work forward, whether we were sharing articles, collecting artifacts, you know, developing the schedules for the instructional rounds, things like that, that it was like coming from them. It was slower, but it was more powerful that way. But I had to be vulnerable and I had to be okay with Ignacio Lopez talks. And I was sad at first, but I was like, no, I have to be mindful that was a lesson for me as a leader. Yeah.
Beautiful. And I love that because it comes from a place that leadership is not this straight shot where we just everything that we do is perfect and here's my book so you can learn from me.
Right.
I love that you go into detail in terms of like being vulnerable to the times that we may have misstep or may have done something, thinking something, and then learning from that lesson so other people don't have to go through that. So talking about teams, how do we create emotional intelligent teams?
Yeah, that's a good question. Sometimes easier said than done. But I do want to say that one of the first steps in really understanding emotionally intelligent teams is understanding the types of teams you have in your building. So you may have, obviously, the way you've organized your committee structure or your grade level teams or your PLCs or whatever that is. Um, every school is different, and they should be, because I think principals, leaders have an opportunity to put their sort of thumbprint on how the structure of the school is sort of running. So that's one. The second is sort of like, okay, what do we know about, if I'm a leader? You've all read, or if you've not, go back and read The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. There's all those really great books that are out there that talk about, is this a real team? And when I talk to school principals who they say, hey, I don't know if this is a real EQ team. And we would say, okay, let's unpack this, right? So there's a lot of other like framing of this, but you can look at, like, you can sort of compartmentalize on a continuum the types of teams in your school. So you can say to yourself, we know that at the very highest level, a team that is, high performing, they're setting growth, they got ideas. We know what a high performing team can look like. And so you work backwards from there. Like, if they're not a high performance team, are they are they a real team, a potential team, or pseudo team? So you start on this sort of, in my mind, it's like, this is not actually a real team. And you want to coach them to be more of a potential team, right? And then you want to move them to being like, so there's this continuum of like, oh, this is not a real team. This is actually like a work group. You know what I mean? Like, these teachers just come together and they share whatever, they sit and they eat their lunch, and they go from there. And by nature of them in a room, they're sort of a work team. They're not really a real team. And so how do you, as a principal or leader, define the continuum of teams in your building? This is important. Why is it important? Because as an EQ leader, the way I coach and I mentor a high performance team is not going to be the same way that I coach and mentor a pseudo team or a weak team. And leaders make the biggest mistake when they try to go in and coach, the pseudo team like a high performing team. That's a mistake, right? Because you go to the team, or even teachers who may be on the lower performing, and you ask the teacher or the team, how are you all doing? And that's the worst question you can ask a pseudo team or a non-functioning team, because they're going to say it's good, and you're going to say, really? Right? So like, then you enter a higher level of conflict. So asking, going back to what I said earlier, asking the right questions is key. So one, what is the, leading EQ teams is sort of like, what is the right structure of teams in my building? And then two, what is the level of high performance? Are they, and you can create your own scale in your own mind if you want to, and there's other versions of this, but you can say, okay, at level one, they're sort of, I share some of these graphs when I work with other leaders, but at level one, they are a pseudo team. At level two, they are a potential team. At level three, they are a real team. And at level four, they are the high performing team. I want to coach my teams to be level 3 or 4, right? And how I do that is different. And so that's a key link to creating EQ teams in your building, is understanding the teams. Yep.
That is a great advice. When I was reading it, the different type of teams, I was thinking the way I have interpreted through my trajectory as a school principal is that you do not coach every team or every teacher like they're Jordan.
Right.
There are some teams and some teachers who are at the Jordan level, and you need to coach them at that level. But you have some that are in the bench.
Yes.
But you still have to coach them and help them be the best versions of themselves. But if you go with the approach of coaching Jordan, you're gonna lose them, and vice versa.
That's right. On that note, I just want to share with your audience, one of the tools that we use is Pete Hall's work on building teacher capacity, and his latest book on creating a culture of self-reflection. And Pete wrote the foreword to the EQA. If you go back and see the foreword, you'll see that Pete was kind enough to write the foreword for me. But he writes a lot about exactly what you're saying. And what I love about what he's done, and I've had the opportunity now to work with him in Houston and in some other states, where we work with instructional coaches, instructional leaders, principals, and others to learn how to ask those questions. Because what we learned was, if you were going to coach Jordan, right, Michael Jordan, what are the questions you would ask Michael Jordan? And then write those out. Let's see. And then if you were going to work with the teacher on the bench, to use your metaphor, what are those questions? And what we learned when we observed coaching in real time is that it's tricky, right? Because if I'm your coach or vice versa, when we sit down to be real about learning, sometimes our emotions and or worries can get in the way, where, and so some of the instructional coaches will say, I'm not sure how to ask the teacher that, or I'm not sure, or I've told her that before, right? So you're like, okay, so let's practice how you want to engage a teacher who's sort of on the bench, right? And you want them to move to this next level of their own reflection and their own actions in the classroom. And so the reflective book that Pete writes about, we use that as a coaching guide to do some of that in schools. Yeah.
Awesome. Great advice, Ignacio. Thank you so much. Ignacio, there's a part of the book where you talk about being in some sort of audience during the closing of the schools, and all school leaders. I remember having people in the LSC, local school council, yelling and I was losing control. I was angry. I was mad. How what is the advice on how to navigate leadership with the naysayers?
Yeah, I love that. So on the one hand, we are I'm just looking at my notes. Let me make sure I have it.
Sure.
So on the one hand, when we do the sort of everyone coming and yelling, and I've been there, by the way, as a board member, as a leader, I've sort of seen it now in my career, from the classroom to the boardroom. I've sort of been able to experience this work. And the best advice for the superintendents and leaders that we've worked with who are in the midst of a galvanized group or conversation, one of the things that I've learned, and this might not work all the time, but in the times that we've seen high conflict around race relations at our boardroom, when the superintendent or leader address the audience by finding or proposing solutions, where in one case, I'm thinking about my mind, the leader said, well, we're going to go out and hire this team. We're going to hire a new diversity officer. We're going to do these interviews. That's not wrong, but it wasn't right for the moment, right? What do we mean by that? When the audience and our students and our families are charged and organized, rightfully or not, the most successful leaders will sit and listen and listen and listen and listen. And in the one instance that I recall very vividly, the leader said, this is appalling, right? The use of the N-word in our district, the issues of race and conflict, it is wrong. And what he said was, I own this, right? I'm the leader. I own this. I will fix this. I will work with you and our teachers and our staff, and we will fix this, but I own this. And if I have not fixed this in 3 years, get rid of me, right? That's powerful, because there's not a lot of superintendents and principals, right? But you can see what he did. What he did was, I own this and I will work. And he did, by the way, in this particular case, he organized and met with all the leaders from community. He then increased the hate speech policy in the student guidebooks for the district, and then created a mandatory 9th grade hate speech unit for the district, right? So he was like, he did the doing, but owned it, as opposed to saying, I'm going to hire somebody who's going to fix this. You hear the difference, right? And
yes.
that was powerful, first and foremost. And we saw that often. We were in Ohio, and I saw something very similar where the superintendent did something similar, and he owned this work around cultural relevance and emotion. And he purposely would zoom in to each of the campuses and would reiterate the power of inclusivity, and had his own sort of method of he couldn't get to all 18 schools in the district, but he was visible electronically to the right? So there's ways that we can sort of move that communication message forward while saying, I remember I'm owning this for us, and navigating that for me is the first big step for navigating resistance and naysaying. And then I have a couple more, if you let me. Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. So not all resistance is bad, right? So sometimes the leaders we worked with, you could sit in those LSC meetings, and you could, or be in your faculty meetings or parent meetings. And this is where listening is key. Like, if you are able to, like, I write about putting your ego aside, because I struggle with this as well. Like, I had to just bury the ego and just listen for listening's sake, and allow for the resistance to or naysaying and skepticism to sort of be shared. You have to address it, right? You have to address it in that moment, and or think about the questioning that you want to sort of have some rebuttals on or some clarification on. That's absolutely a must. I can talk about that here in a second. But this idea that, okay, not all resistance is bad. What is there something that I can learn from this resistance? If it's resistance that's just nasty and like against a person or a student, we know as educators we can't use names. There's privacy laws. We can't, we don't do that. So we have to shut that down right away, and have the courage to shut it down right away in the midst of those sort of levels of resistance. So that's key, sort of understanding in the moment of resistance, is this going to help me? Can I make an informed decision with this, or do I have to shut this down? That's a key piece of this. The other thing is that I always remind educators on, and this doesn't happen everywhere, but I've seen it happen in communities that organize a lot, especially in our city schools and in other sort of urban areas, which is great. However, what we have seen lately is naysayers and or resistors in our communities. For some reason, they are perceived by others to sort of have a strong independent leadership mind. And then there's this like support to lift that naysayer or resistor to a position of like power or prestige. And that can be harmful for us as principals and leaders, if it's the same like voices or voice. Sometimes naysayers and resistors can be seen as leaders, and you and I both know that it's like, in some areas of resistance in terms of fighting for additional supports for kids, yeah. But if it's something that's super contrary to our values and our missions as a school, we have to shut it down. We have to address it right away, and that goes back to the courage, right? You like my go-to in the middle of conflict when we're in meetings or faculty meetings or with the unions, what I think I hear you saying is, and then I want to reframe this, and then I'll reframe a question, and sometimes there's no answer to that question, but then I have an opportunity to answer my question, and then reframe or reset the narrative as the leader. But I have to do it right there. It's like saying, in one instance, we saw a teacher say, well, our scores are low because we have so many ESL kids. And we were like, right, time out, right? Like, let's address this, right? What are we doing to elevate all learners in the district so that we can see growth in all learners, and all learners is also our ESL kids. We have to address that right there, because what happens is the narrative of like, oh yeah, it's ESL kids, it goes into the building, right? We can't have that. It's like someone saying, well, not all children can learn. We cannot have that. Like you have to be listening for those sort of that level of resistance that's like skepticism and like and you got to address it right away. Yeah.
Amen. Thank you so much. And finally, in terms of the book, at the end you mentioned that the emotional intelligent leader has to know when to leave a leadership position.
Yeah.
What advice do you have for those who cannot do that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. This sort of ties into the last conversation, and then I can add it to the end. When we work with our seasoned leaders, one of the things that I learned in working with those seasoned leaders, they've been doing this 20, 30 plus years, they recognize, right, and they can say to themselves, is this a problem to solve or a tension to manage? And what we mean by that is you and I as leaders every year will experience tensions, right? Every year we go through a budget cycle. Every year we're looking at number of teachers per classroom or the ratio of students. And your teachers will always be like, am I going to teach their grade again next year? Am I going to go for it? Am I going to go? Like that is a reality, and it is a tension that you and I every year will have to navigate. And it creates these weird sticky things every year. And sometimes the unions and labor, they're involved because you will always have to navigate those pieces and those tensions. There are instances when we have problems to solve, right? Like, hey, this math curriculum is 20 years old. We really need to solve, right? And move to this. And we're going to challenge ourselves to move to that. I think as leaders, when we have been doing this 30 plus years, at least the leaders that I have been working with, they start to find, not every leader, but there's a level of like patience in the tension because it's repetitive. If you've been doing this 30 years, every year for the last 30 years, the same tensions are there, right? And there's a level of self-awareness, patience, self-regulation, sort of the EQ way to navigate that. If we are leaders that can continue, one, to have that EQ as we navigate those tensions and not just get frustrated and say, oh, we did this already last year. You already know, teachers, right? Like that's when you start to lose you lose a little bit of ground as a leader, if you will. And I think that there's something to be said about that. The second is, in the midst of understanding both those tensions and problems, emotionally intelligent leaders at that 30 plus level mark, not only do we sort of battle with self-regulation, we also battle with motivation, right? So you look at sort of the research on emotional intelligence and leadership, we often work with leaders who they have the same drive for kids and same wish for moms and dads, but maybe there's some shifts in their motivation. And this isn't wrong, by the way. This is not like, oh, you should always be motivated. We're human and we are emotional creatures. We're social creatures. And so you will vacillate between your motivation to do this work or maybe something else that's more exciting. And you'll also vacillate between that self-regulation for managing through tensions or problems, because it in the heat of it all, we have to be the most EQ leader, especially because we have more and more of these sort of challenges and problems. When we start to sort of close off, and we've seen this with leaders, they'll say, no, don't get back to that teacher, or you know what, let's just have these 4 teachers, It's instead of finding the balances to embrace resistance or navigate tensions, I think we ask leaders to think about what's the next step for them, what's their purpose. I was able to do a study and did a course at Penn State years ago on leadership and academic leadership, and they sort of showed this like bell curve, and the research shows like as a leader, like in the sort of top of the bell curve. Things are well, your culture, your relationships, your funding, your budgetary, your fundraising, your students are learning. And then you get to the back end of that bell curve. And if you're still in education at the very end of that bell curve, because you've lost some motivation, you've lost how to navigate tensions, you may want to consider a succession plan to bring and elevate somebody else, because you will get more motivation as a leader when you give someone else the chance to rise and to be lifted. I worked with leaders recently. I actually just talked to 2 leaders this weekend. They were like, they're getting ready to retire, but they're coaching new leaders, and they have a passion and a sparkle in their eye because they're helping this new leadership coming behind them. And I think there's something powerful in that as well. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. So much wisdom here. Let's take a quick moment to celebrate the Teach Better community.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. Explore more podcasts at www.teachbetterpodcastnetwork.com. Now let's get back to the episode.
So, Ignacio, let's talk a little bit about productivity. As you know, being successful includes being on top of our productivity, but this means different things for different people. How do you get organized in order to still have a fructiferous life?
Yes, that's a great question. I like to write in the mornings. I learned, in the last several years that I like to get connected to, this might sound a little spiritual or whatnot, but sometimes we can connect to words or inspiration at different times throughout the day. And my mind isn't so cloudy, and in the morning I feel fresh. So what I've been doing to get organized is really thinking about, can I set time from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. just to focus on the writing, whether I'm writing or researching or reading. And that habit is really helpful, especially when you have a book that's contracted and you're on a deadline to get the book done. But even when you're not on contract, you are still leveraging some of that time to seek wisdom in the research or writing or podcasts or other leaders doing some really cool work. And so you do that. And then I purposely, this last 2 years, I started to make sure I have time to take my 2 younger girls to school in the morning at 8:15. And then I'm able to drive into work. My office is downtown Chicago, so I'm able to work downtown and spend time down there. The world of like flex and remote schedule has been really beautiful, because if you can be one day, where you can do if we're in a position where we can do this, sort of the one day that I can be remote, you can block out like 12 to 1 where you can go exercise. So you have a plan to be writing and researching. You have a plan to be helping your family. You have a plan to be at work, to do good work at work. But then you have to squeeze in that time for your physical health as well. And so I do Orange Theory, which I really enjoy. I don't know if your audience
can you tell us what Orange Theory is?
Yeah, so it is. It's a workout fitness center, and they provide the workouts for you. It's an hour, 60 minutes. Sometimes it's 50 minutes, and you do some treadmill work, you do some rowing work, and then you do some floor exercises, and then you go home. But what I love about it is, I guess when I was younger, I'd like to go to the gym and I can invent my own exercises. I think when I'm older, I just someone tell me what to do and I can do it, And so I like to take the class. It's also for me like going to gym class, right? Like as a kid again. And so I like to say, okay, I'm going to schedule my gym class at least twice a week. We go and the coaches are there. They tell you what to do, and in an hour you're in, you're out, and you're back to work. So yeah.
Beautiful. So important to take care of our health. We talk about all this stuff, and you and I both have many colleagues who are suffering in their retirement age because they gave everything to everybody, but they forgot to take care of themselves.
That's right.
So very important.
Yep.
Ignacio, how do you do calendar and your to-do list? Pen and paper, an app? What do you do?
I'm a pen and paper person. I have several notebooks all over the house, but I do like several filled notebooks because I always have one notebook that's with me that I fill and I sort of keep a tab. I also have like just a legal pad that I can always like go back to. So in the morning, since there's so much work at the university and I have 3 big teams that I help to lead there, I'm always reprioritizing. So if I'm able to spend the time research writing in the morning, I'm in the office by like 9:15, 9:30, and I can spend the first 20, 30 minutes just prioritizing, unless there's like a big fire with a like big issue or something that's escalated that I have to address right away. But if you can spend 5 minutes just reorganizing in my notebook, I gotta write it down kind of a guy. And there's something for me about the pen to paper that helps me remember that, I had these 12 things I needed to do today. I also then feel accomplished. If I get through half of this, I'm going to feel so good, Yeah.
Beautiful. No, definitely pen and paper is a must. Even if you use an app, use the pen and paper too.
Yeah.
So this is your second book that you publish. For those who are dreaming of writing a book, what lessons have you learned about creating a book from the moment of idea to actually getting it published?
Yeah. The first is to like put your ideas out there, right? I mentioned this earlier, but it would be if you've got an idea for a book or an article, or I would try to present it in public, right? Because you're going to get a lot of feedback in public, and there's a lot of conferences both locally and regionally that you can submit to, even if it's 10 or 15 people that come to your session. That's fine, because you want to see if your ideas are going to help, right? You don't want to write a book just because you want to, just for the sake of it. I think you have to approach this with a level of, I want to help, right? I'm hoping, I'm praying that this is going to help leaders and teachers. And so you got to start from that, and or students, if you're writing about and working with supporting students or communities or families, like you want to have a product that helps. That's key. You also need to understand the history, the literature. I've learned, and those of us that have written dissertations, we know that my idea isn't the only idea. There's probably several other 100 people who had a very similar idea out there, and you want to find those people and give those people credit as well. And that will help you sort of organize your literature and your references as you're sort of navigating through the book. I think that's a big first. So that's sort of like the curating of how you want to go about putting your ideas together, and then bouncing them off with other authors. If you have at conferences, that's always a good thing. Or reach out. Some people just email me and say, "Hey, Ignacio, I'm interested in writing a book." And I have 2 students that reached out to me who are doing their master's. And they said, "We're also interested in writing." And I said, "Yeah, let's go meet for coffee and let's think." So they just reached out to me, through email. And so that's sort of the curation of that. I think once you're ready to write, you want to be able to find a publishing house. On the one hand, you can self-publish, which is great. Amazon's got some nice products. On the other hand, if you can work with a publisher, right, ASCD or ISTE or Teacher College Press or Corwin, right, these big education publishing houses, they're really nice, because if you can get contracted through them, they will help with all your marketing. They will help with the promotions. They will help also find clientele if you wind up doing consulting work. And so they do sort of and they have the resources to do that as a larger organization, as opposed to just writing it yourself or self-publishing. I think that's key. So that's the second big idea, is like, who's the publisher, who you think you can write. Find books that are similar to what it is that you want to write, or the genre that you're sort of speaking to in that space of if it's a PD book, or is it a book for a classroom? Like what is it? That's important. And then lastly, and there's several more, but I would say once you've identified that publishing house, like who's the acquisitions editor, you should know the language of publishing, right? There's an acquisitions editor, there's a copy editor. Those people you need to know, because when I was out in the world and I didn't know what an acquisitions editor is or was, but I got introduced to Jenny years ago, and Jenny's the acquisitions editor for ASCD. What does an acquisitions editor do? She acquires people to write books. So I was like, oh, I know it sounds silly, but like I wanted, like, it was important for me to tell Jenny, hey, I'm presenting at 2:00. Jenny, you should come and see, right? Why is that important? Because she can come see my session. And if the audience is resonating with my content, then I can go back to her and say, hey, I want to write this. I have this idea for this book. And then you can sort of shop the idea with an acquisitions editor if you have that relationship. And then you can go write and submit the actual proposal. And the proposal can take time. Depending on the publishing house, they will submit your chapter and your proposal for review or blind review nationally to several authors across the country. And the blind review comes back and it feels good or it feels not good. And if it doesn't feel good, then they won't contract you. If sometimes they'll say, if you change this, maybe we'll publish it. Or if you say this, and they'll work with you. So I submitted. So when I wrote Keeping It Real and Relevant, I had submitted to 2 other publishers and was denied. And then I submitted to ASCD and they published Keeping It Real, which was the first book. When I went to write the EQA, I had embedded a lot more of cultural relevance, and I had shopped that idea also with ACD and some others, and everyone said no. They all turned the manuscript down. But I went back and I talked to Jenny and said, hey, what if we frame it around this? Because I had these steps, but I had this idea of working with leaders through difficulty. And we frame it around this concept of EQ and emotional intelligence. And so I reworked that, and then they agreed to it. What happens then that people don't know is, in the publishing world, it is a product. So you have to write a business case for your book. So not only do I have to go through all the hurdles to finally get to almost a yes, they then have to put it in a, like, will this thing sell test? And your acquisitions editor and your editor, the second person, they will help you write the business case for you, because that goes to the publisher, the actual, the actual publisher, he or she, and the committee make the final decision on. And so sometimes you can get all the way through to after review, blind review, it goes to the publisher, and they can deny it at that level too, at that very last level. But once it passes that last level, you'll get a call from the acquisitions editor saying, hey, they love it. It's a go. We're going to go ahead and contract you. When do you think you can finish it? And then you get into all of those details. But
wow, it's so much more complicated than than people think. Thank you so much for sharing all that inside scoop. And one more question in terms of organization. You recently presented ASCD and you have presented in multiple conferences. What lessons have you learned in how to create a Google Slide or PowerPoint that is ideal for a conference? Because it is harder than we think. Because I remember at least my first presentations, they were full of text that nobody was reading and they were so boring. What lessons have you learned and what advice do you have?
Yeah, I agree. I think less is more, and it depends on the conference audience style. I used to, again, want or need to feel like I had to talk a lot, but the truth was, if you can frame your slides in a way that is around problems of practice. So if you treat your lessons or your sessions like a consultancy protocol, if you will, you can Google consultancy protocol and you can leverage those sort of protocols to actually lead your conference session. So it feels more engaging. It feels like you're leveraging the knowledge and the power in the room. And so we frame the way I've done it, at least the last few times, has been, here's 7 big ideas of practice as we're navigating challenges. What are the key essential questions we want to ask about navigating resistance, or how do I work with and or build emotionally intelligent teams, right? Or how do I assess the clarity of my communication during difficult times? And so we frame those sessions in like these just questions, maybe with an image, and then we turn it back on the audience. And then we'll try to say, okay, what you're saying, oh, and by the way, here's 2-3 things that I learned. And so so the slides are less, but it really is, the slides act more as a facilitation than like a presentation. And I think that that's been really, really helpful. The other thing is, if there is a lot on the slides, sometimes I will have them read, like silent read. So I'll say, I'm going to share with you 5 quotes, right? If we're talking about naysaying and a resistance, what are some practices that you're navigating, et cetera, et cetera. We talk about solutions. And then after we're done, I'll say something like, okay, I'm going to share with you five things on the slide. I'm not going to read them. You're going to sit there and read these by yourself silently. And then you're going to say which of these 5 resonates with you. And then you all will turn and talk. So that level of like, when we use the slides, are actually being used as a facilitator, not a presentation per se.
I like it. I think I have failed in many of my conference presentations where I talk. And when the reviews come back, people talk about, hey, it's not engaging, because in a way, people want to hear themselves too and say, hey, I'm thinking this, tell me more. So thank you. That's great advice. And Ignacio, finally, when you take off your hat of professor, researcher, writer, presenter, what do you do for fun?
Lately, we've been golfing a lot. My son and my 13-year-old daughter, we are golfing. My son's on the golf team at the high school, so we've been doing a lot of golfing and hanging out. I also like to go to different venues where there's live music. I also serve as the chair of the Puerto Rican Art Alliance here in the city of Chicago, and we host and curate, music events, salsa events in the city. We host a Cuatro festival every year. And so I would say every month there's 2 or 3 culture and arts related events that I like to spend time in, just to also, I think, tap into a different side of your brain when you're thinking about arts and creativity. And I really like to do that as well.
Awesome. Ignacio, it has been such a pleasure having you in the show. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm hoping that all of this continues to help. Yeah.
For sure. Take care, man.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Wisdom and Productivity, the podcast of Dr. Efraín Martinez.
Chulo.
And as of that production, chill out.